Just ahead of our next panel on the challenges of rural deployment, I'm joined by Matt Hunter, Managing Director of Hellermann Tyton Connectivity. Matt, I know you're going to chair this session, but before we start, tell us if you think the government's kind of got the right approach to providing the incentives and the conditions for rural fibre deployment.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, Brian. I think the approach with the outside in and the LFFN is, it's a strong place to move forward from the government, and they are making some of the right noises, and there is good activity and good intent. I think there's still questions around, certainly with the LFFN side and targeting public buildings, whether that truly helps the rural build. I think it's very good for edge suburbia, shall we say, so semi-rural, but I think the rural is the real challenge, and it's part that's not really been picked up properly, I feel, by the government as of yet. I think we all know the current situation that we're in, and where is money going to come from to do this, but then at the same time, there is the need to, or certainly there seems to be a trend that is pushing more people out of the cities towards the countryside. So the major conurbations, whilst they are key activity areas, that you're certainly seeing a lot more people working from home, a lot of remote offices set up in much smaller amounts of people, which I think the government does need to probably reevaluate now. And I think they've done everything right so far, but I think we're in a changing environment, and I think more and more people are going to move to the countryside for their offices, for their workplace. And I think that requires a different type of investment. Now, whether that can be led from the larger ISPs that are looking to roll out in semi-suburban areas once they finish the high density areas, and then roll out from there, or whether that's Openreach, or one of the areas that has never really been targeted. I know certainly INCA has worked very closely with lots of councils, but actually dropping down even a stage further into the parish councils, where we can actually see things really move forward and be really local in their development. And I think there's some companies, well, there certainly is some companies around, such as Barn, where groups of people have got together to move forward with the government incentives and push it forward. But it requires somebody to lead that outside of the top ISPs as such. And I think that's the missing link at the moment, the rural, semi-rural and edge suburban.
In the really hard to reach areas, what are some of the big challenges that the independent network providers are going to face?
I think it depends on the size and scale of the ISP, because if we look now, some of the ISPs are working their way towards major national telcos. So I think if we look at someone that sort of, let's say somebody like Gigacleus really sort of targets semi-rural and rural areas, some of their challenges is it's really the length of distance between each property and the cost, and there isn't really any PIA in those areas. There is the ability to soft plough, which is obviously a lot more cost effective than having to dig any roads, but there is still a cost there. And I think actually the government have just put forward a document looking at the use of other utilities other than the telecom utilities, and I think that's a very interesting step forward to how you can use different parts of the infrastructure to provide really that last 10% that everyone's sort of turning a phrase of now. Some farms, they can cost up to £10,000 for one connection, which isn't viable for these ISPs. So it's some of the hurdles to overcome are really over distance and the cost to put in that infrastructure. So the more we can look to use other infrastructure, whether that be electricity, gas, water, I think I think that's a very positive step forward. The more we can look at those areas of utilities.
And what sort of products and services have Hellermann Tyton got that can help with some of these issues?
Well, certainly Hellermann Tyton connectivity obviously incorporates the Gabacon brand now, which is a ducting solution. So we have all the blown fibre bundles that can go across that area, whether that be pushed or blown. But then also we have a pre-connectorized system within our FDN. So our FDN is our fibre distribution node. Now that can sit underground. So in areas of natural beauty, which a lot of the countryside is, we can go to a connectorized solution. Now that's really important over long distances in the fact that it reduces the skill level that's required. And especially when things are very rural, you're not going to have a huge amount of connections per closure or per cabinet. So actually being able to plug in the connector is a lot more cost effective than sending engineers out to splice everywhere all the time. So that's one of our key advantages is our FDN connectorized solution. We also have that in an aerial fibre node as well. So again, that solution is there. So we can give you a complete plug and play system that sits down that whole network all the way to the home, where we provide even cables within the building. So if, for example, you go to an old manor house, which is very, very rural, we also have the opportunity for a fully connectorized MDU solution to push that through, as well as fire graded ducting to be able to be led around that building as well. So real that complete end-to-end solution from the purely passive side of fibre optics.
Now, I know you have quite a lot of experience. Just tell me a little bit about some of the work you did with GigaClear, for example.
Yeah, so GigaClear is it's a nice story. Hellermann Tyton have provided product to GigaClear pretty much, I think, since day one. So what we did with GigaClear is actually looked at some of their issues they were having with being able to deploy over such large distances, and obviously the type of network that they do. And actually we worked closely with other manufacturers as well. So we didn't just base it solely on what Hellermann Tyton connectivity could offer. We actually worked very closely with the other infrastructure providers within GigaClear and looked for that solution that we could add for them. So they use our FDM product. Again, it's obviously one of the more chosen products in the marketplace, which we're extremely pleased with, but also from their street cabinet solution and actually looking at how they can scale today, but also how that product can suit them in the future. So it wasn't really just built for today. The ability to upgrade and add to that is built within that cabinet. And certainly with the products that connected to the home, we looked at solutions with cable providers that could make the ease of installation much simpler. So actually there is the ability on their home connection box to store up to 50 meters of blown fibre cable. So again, engineers are very expensive for the skill that they bring. So for home connections, the easier we can make that connection, the better it is. So they can be provided with 25-meter lengths of drop cable. So they're not constantly cutting and splicing in their van, and actually just pre-connectorized and connect into the home and store any additional storage that's left over within that box. So some very simple things, but the simple things make the most difference.
Just before you go to the conference, one last thing. Are there any areas of the country where fibre just isn't the answer? And if so, what should happen there?
I think that's a two-tier question, I think. So I think every part of the country eventually should have a fibre connection. I just don't think that's possible with the timescales and the costs that are currently asked for within within the targets that we're being given from the government. Now, whether they're realistic or not is another question. I think short term, there is a place for wireless connectivity in the very, very rural areas, but I think that's only a stopgap, and I think you've got to look at the financial model. If it makes sense to go to a wireless network for 3 to 5 years and then bring in a full fibre system, I'm not sure where that stacks up financially. So for me, I think everywhere should have fibre connectivity. I think if we're looking to speed things up, I think wireless is an option. But the end goal should be that everyone, like the copper network, has the ability to plug in a fibre.
Okay, well, we'll look forward to that with interest. Thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you very much to Brian for that, Brian and to Matt for that interview, really useful. And now we're going to go on to actually having a discussion about some of those really challenging and difficult areas for reaching the government targets. So I'd like to invite Matt to come and join the stage now and move into the panel session. Hi,
Hello,
Matt.
everybody.
Hi, Matt. Great interview, really useful.
Thank you. Okay, so to start the panel, I'd like to introduce James Saunby, Hector Gibson-Fleming, Catherine Colloms, Michael Armitage, Ryan Lewis, Matt Fletcher, and Ian Scorah. Sorry, Ian, if I'm not pronouncing your name properly.
Michael,
okay,
just before we start, Matt, Michael Armitage was having some problems with PlusNet being down. Ironic, as it seems. But I think he's here. Oh, yeah, you managed to get your phone working.
We've got Michael.
So I'm in whatever form fixed wireless integration is working.
Fantastic.
Fantastic, fantastic. So if we could just run through the panelists and ask them to introduce themselves. So James, if you could please kick us off.
Yes, good morning, James Saunby. I'm founder of GreySky Consulting, and I spend most of my working life over the last sort of 15 years trying to deal with rural broadband issues.
Excellent. And Hector, you could introduce yourself.
I'm Hector Gibson-Fleming from Wessex Internet. We're a rural provider operating in the southwest, so primarily Dorset, Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire. And we're building end-to-end networks using our own infrastructure across the area.
Fantastic. Catherine, if you could please introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure, Matt. Hi, everyone. Catherine Colloms. I'm Director of Corporate Affairs and Brand at Openreach. So obviously you all know us, the incumbent operator, nationwide operator, ambition to build full fibre across the whole of the UK, getting to around 20 million premises in the mid-2020s and probably around 5 million rural by then as well.
Fantastic. And Michael, yourself?
Yeah, Michael Armitage, founder and chief executive of Broadway Partners. We are also an ISP operating in rural areas with particular focus on South and Mid Wales and Scotland.
Fantastic. And Ryan?
Yeah, morning guys, Ryan Lewin from BDUK. So really pleased to be able to join you today in place of Matt and his apologies. I am part of the BDUK Vouchers commercial team. So BDUK is currently, as you know, design of the UK Gigabit programme. So our £5 billion programme that will focus on delivering gigabit capability to the final 20% of the UK. And today I'd be particularly interested in hearing your views on how you see vouchers playing a part in achieving that 2025 target.
Perfect. And Ian?
Hi there, it's Ilan, Scorah here from...
Ilan, sorry.
Don't worry. From Voneus Broadband. We're a national fixed wireless operator serving the UK in very rural and remote areas. Our plan is to provide fixed wireless access to allow customers to have superfast broadband in the short term, with the bid and the kind of conversion program to then flip over to fibre in the future.
Thank you, Ilan. And last but not least, Matt.
Hi, Matt Fletcher from Duraline. We're probably the largest microduct and PVC duct supplier you've never heard of, but that's my job to change it. My personal involvement with rural connectivities goes back to about 30 years with European Space Agency projects to develop satellite terminals for remote African villages. And more recently with Duraline, been looking at projects to reduce the cost of remote connectivity and introducing things like do-it-yourself rural broadband kits to get people to just kind of digging themselves.
Okay, so I'm going to kick us off with a few questions, and I think the first one I'd like to direct at Michael, and then some of the maybe Hector and Ilan to intervene is really around investment models and the opportunity for investors in the rural market, and what is their view on investing in rural broadband delivery?
Okay, really interesting question. Wasn't expecting that straight off. I thought I'd have at least of a warm-up. Anyway, good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks very much to Malcolm and the organisation team for inviting me. So, what is the investors' view of this? Well, I mean, I think it's well known that there's a growing body of investors who are looking at fibre as a new asset class. I've been quietly banging on about this for a couple of years now, but as long as there was technology risk associated with it, with investing in broadband, I think it was always going to be looked on as a slightly sort of speculative private equity type activity. But now that we're looking at really solid fibre infrastructure, it is definitely becoming an asset class in itself. So, who would want to invest in an airport anymore? Who would want to invest in a train system anymore? Everybody wants to be putting money into digital infrastructure, and I think there is. I mean, it's not to overstate it to say there's something of a tidal wave of interest among investors looking at fibre infrastructure. And the reasons for that are clear. I mean, the obvious, obviously, is the demand trends. I don't know how many times COVID is going to be mentioned, but I mean that's been a huge fillip to the sector in the last few months. But the technology trend is very clear. Moving towards a fibre-rich and 5G wireless-enabled sort of mixed media type environment, I think just creates enormous capacity for very predictable returns over a long term, and with interest rates at zero effectively and possibly going negative, pension funds need a return, and a 5 to 10% yield on a fibre asset is exactly what they want to see. So I mean, it's very general, high-level sort of observations, but I think there's no doubt that fibre is in the sweet spot of investors' interest at the moment.
Fantastic. Hector, what's your experience with this?
I mean, I think we're probably one of the sort of slightly different model in terms of. I completely agree with what Michael's saying in terms of. He said tidal wave. I was going to say wall of money that seems to be hitting everyone, and you only need to listen to the first panel, and most people's credentials listed off with the amount of capital that they've got behind them. And I think from our perspective, I think most business models that really applies. If you want to be scaled to be nationwide, then great, raise the capital and go and work out how to use it. But we certainly see big chunks of the industry from our perspective who the biggest problem is how to spend the capital, not raising it, and there's certainly enough money around in the industry now for everyone. Our perspective is that we want to build a really, really solid local business that's got great respect, and that means building in a way that builds good process, builds really good business. And I think that sometimes takes a slightly slower approach. That means it's really important, as well as just getting the capital and the investment, that you understand how to run the business and how to expand, and what your model looks like, and that you can build a really consolidated, a model that you can expand and you can deliver on. And I think the biggest challenge everyone's been talking about this morning, and I'm sure throughout the day, is around delivery and how we all scale. And I think capital. We've got to the point where capital isn't the issue in the market now.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Hector. And Ilan, across to yourself, from from almost a fixed wireless perspective, are you finding investment levels for the rural build attainable, and does the business plan run in line to get that support?
Yeah, I mean, Voneus has been backed by Macquarie most recently in 2019 to scale up our fixed wireless business. But they're very much an infrastructure fund, and the plan of attack with fixed wireless is very much in the short term to provide communities with super fast fibre connections so they can get on with things and actually live their lives in a way that they haven't been able to before on copper. And once we get to a certain level of penetration within the communities, then we then look to convert onto fibre and to provide that infrastructure in the long term. So from a fixed wireless perspective with Macquarie and the way we're looking at it, it's a safer bet to get to a level of penetration before then investing heavily into fibre. And that's the model that we've taken. And to be kind of accurate in terms of where we are today, we've had success with that model, and we're looking to flip our first 4 communities before the end of the year onto fibre. And as we get those penetration levels up and the other communities we're working with, we'll do the same. So we think we've got a good model in terms of that conversion strategy. And I think in the rural market, in terms of investment, what you're seeing probably in the inner cities is that there's huge amounts of investment and large amounts of competition. And those investment funds now are looking outside of those inner conurbations and looking to the rural market for the next step of investment.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Alan. And I'll move across to Catherine, just to understand Openreach's approach to rural and how that fits with their financial models and within their planning schedule.
Yeah, sure, happy to. I mean, so as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, I think the way we approach rural is a little bit different in the sense that as the nationwide provider and with the ambition to be a nationwide full fibre provider, we kind of don't see a distinction between rural and other build. You know, we're not just a city fibre builder. We've been building in loads of rural areas for sort of decades, you know, both with the superfast network, but also actually a lot of our early full fibre build was in rural areas through BDUK. So we actually have extensive experience of building in rural. I mean, I think our view a bit back to the previous panel and the fact that this has to be a collective and sort of partnership effort between all of us in industry and government to try and hit the kind of big targets around 2025 and in particular rural connectivity. You know, we very much see the principle of a balanced build as really important to that. So while we obviously have specialist rural builders and we know a lot about how to build rural, you know, we kind of see this responsibility to do rural and do commercial rural as well as doing our sort of more urban and sort of area 1, 2 kind of build. So we've announced of commercial rural build in the last couple of months. Again, what we're trying to do is innovate as far as we can and try and push the commercial model as far as we can into rural. What we don't want to do is spend taxpayers' money on stuff that we think could potentially be commercial. And I think, you know, a lot of us on this panel, on previous panels, can prove that actually you can make rural very commercial. So we're trying to push that boundary as far as we can. You know, we think it could potentially go beyond the 80%, so, you know, well into the 80s and up to 90%. So that's our kind of commercial program. And then like everyone else, I think the critical thing is how do we work successfully with government and BDUK and others on getting the structure of the 5 billion right. And I think that's the really critical thing. No one person can deliver this. Definitely no one partner can deliver the sort of really tough final 10%. We're going to have to all take off bits. So the procurement model and the way in which that we contract with the 5 billion is going to have to be attractive for investment, both for really large scale operators like us, but also for smaller operators. So I think getting that procurement right, getting the lot sizes right, and getting the terms and conditions right are actually going to be fundamental to whether we can really go hard and fast on the government's sort of final 10% targets.
Yeah, no, I think that brings us to an interesting question that's come up on the Q&A. And I think maybe if I could ask Matt this question, is overbuild a significant risk in rural areas? You know, do Openreach expect to build new FTTP networks in rural areas? And AltNets have already done so. I think Catherine's answered that question. But from a manufacturer side, overbuild, being a manufacturer myself as well, is it's quite a nice thing for us. What's your view from a network perspective, but also from a manufacturer's perspective?
So from a manufacturer's perspective, then we're like you. We much prefer you to put 10 ducts in the ground where one would do, because we'll sell 10 times as much. Although with my environmental hat on, I can't 100% agree. But what we are seeing in sort of experience from other countries, especially quite rural areas, but we'll be a bit careful with rural areas. We tried to take experience from the US, from Canada, from Central and Northern Europe, and map it onto the UK. You've got to remember that rural areas in the UK aren't actually quite as open as we think. So if you go along the verge with a mole plough, expecting to do sort of 5-10 kilometres a day, which in other countries we can achieve, you're going to hit lots of driveways and roads and bridges and little curtilages, etc. So you can't necessarily go that fast. So be a bit careful about sort of assuming that these models work here. What we do think, what we are seeing work, and I think probably still the best example I've seen would be broadband for rural north, is where you can get local communities to cooperate. Then there's rather than overbuild, you can jointly build. It doesn't cost very much more to dig a hole in the ground and put 3 pipes in than it does 1. So suddenly you've got capacity to have 2 or 3 physically separated operators. And on top of that, of course, you can have virtually separated operators, although most people I talk to want to be physically separated if they can. So it probably goes back to, I think, to one of the earlier points about, actually, I think from your interview about cooperating at a parish level with a rural broadband. But we're certainly seeing in other countries, and we've seen it in the UK, where if you offer a farmer a broadband to his business, and it may be several businesses because he may have converted barns to office units, he'll be willing to invest in that, especially if he can do some of the work himself, the expensive bit, digging the hole. And if you make that as part of a bigger network to go on to another community, suddenly you're spreading the investment. So yeah, cooperation is really key where money's so tight. Sorry, I've whittled on a bit there. I'll hand it back.
No, it's fine. I think Hector's got a question or an interjection there.
Yeah, I think we're probably one of the most similar operators in terms of our model with comparables to what Barnes doing. And I think I wholeheartedly agree with what Matt's saying around, this isn't America, and I think the complications of hitting of driveways and things like that in rural, if you're going to go down the verge, but even if you go across more rural areas, the weather that we've got here in the winter can make it challenging. And also almost the more complicated bit for soft dig build is the more built up rural areas. If someone's got 10,000 acres of farmland, you can almost go and do a deal with them. Oh yeah, you go where you like, absolutely fine. If you connect my buildings, that's fantastic. When they've got 10 acres, it's their pride and joy, and that's now really complicated, and that negotiation takes longer. And so the really rural areas, can lend themselves to build models that you won't in the sort of what most people would call rural, but what we would call the sort of heading towards the sort of pony paddock territories on the edge of towns and things, which that then gets much more challenging. But I think your comment around the farmers is definitely, it's a model that will work in places and it's helpful. I think the concern is, at the end of the day, we're all talking about building 40 and 50-year infrastructure. And if a third of your 40, 50-year infrastructure model has been built by a farmer who didn't know that it was really critical to make sure it was 60 centimeters or a meter deep, not 30, 40 centimeters deep, when he hit a bit of hard ground and it was 5 o'clock on a Friday, actually, are you building really good quality infrastructure? And that's the one thing for us. We want to build infrastructure that doesn't get hit. That is, we know we've got the quality. We know our teams know how to build it. And we know there are technicalities that actually something built poorly or not done in quite the right way because the farmer's only doing it for their 600 meters, we don't believe is scalable in a professional infrastructure model. So I think I completely agree with a lot of things you're saying, and it's really important, but there's definitely some hesitations there around using farmers too heavily.
Yes.
I think, sorry, can I jump in?
James? I'm surprised it took this long.
Well, I was trying to be polite, you know how it is. This all brings together part of the dilemma that we've got, because we've got the investment community that sees full fibre and, as Hector says, really good quality full fibre infrastructure as being a really solid investment. That's great. That's not going to get everywhere by the end of 2025. It's just too slow. So what we want is, I absolutely agree with the sort of the Voneus approach, where take that high bandwidth fixed wireless access and deploy that. That can be deployed in rural areas at great speed, because we have a problem at the moment. The average bandwidth requirement for a UK household, according to Ofcom, is about 4 megabits per second. That means that at busy hour, for 95% of homes, you need about 4 times that. So let's say just under 20 megabits per second. That's fine. So superfast broadband FTTC just about supports that. Problem is, it's growing at about 34% every year. So by a bit after 2025, FTTC superfast broadband isn't fast enough to support the busy hour demand of a UK household, which means shortly after 2025, the demand for something better is going to be really quite relentless from just about everywhere. We'll say it again, COVID-19, everyone says, yeah, it's great, fantastic. The broadband networks have really sort of stepped up to everyone working from home and for us doing this. If it had happened a year later, actually, it might not have done. We are at that sort of tipping point. So we need to do something, but you need to do something very quickly. Investing in full fibre is great, but it's going to take too long. The investment model for fixed wireless access for most operators is looking quite weak. So that's where we've got a bit of a problem. That's what we need to fund, and that's looking a bit more difficult.
Yeah, and maybe I can bring Ryan in on that just before yourself, Michael. Obviously, the BDUK programme has been a big help to growing the marketplace. Maybe you could just give us some thoughts on some of the points that James has just made.
Yeah, absolutely. So BDUK, as you say, has focused on growing market capacity over the last while. As we've been moving through our design phases for the 2025 programme to launch next year, one of the key pieces we've looked at there is ensuring we design a programme that enables us to harness all of the available market capacity from smaller operators. And obviously, as we touched on in the investment part earlier, operators have come onto the scene over the last while. Others have grown with investment backing. So we've been really conscious of designing a programme that harnesses all of that available capacity. We'll be coming out very shortly, actually, to talk in more detail around our procurement approach. One of the questions which has got the sort of most likes in the Q&A that I guess is linked to what we're discussing now is how do we ensure smaller altnets win, I guess, for some of the build contracts. So as I say, we've been making sure that we harness all of the available market capacity in our design phases. We'll come out and talk about that in more detail very shortly, but what that means at a sort of headline level is there will be bundles released through our dynamic purchasing system, which we've spoken about in detail at our outside and engagement events, as well as those and those smaller bundles that will move through the DPS. We also plan on releasing larger contract sizes as well, and that's in response to market feedback that we've received as we've moved through the design phases. So we'll have small contracts, which I guess will to some of the smaller altnet players. We'll also have larger contracts there running in tandem as well. So we think we'll have a model that works for both large and small players, and ensuring we sort of, as I say, harness all of that available capacity.
Yeah. Okay. Just so one of the Q&As that's been raised really to Voneus and to Wessex. The subsidies in the BDUK programme were almost exclusively won by BT. Are the panel optimistic that the 5 billion rural subsidy programme will be structured to enable smaller altnets to win build subsidies? Now, I think Ryan's detailed that quite well there, but from your views, is it a level playing field?
I think it's an interesting question. I mean, we're doing quite a lot of work, and we're working with BDUK about the kind of pros and cons of the outside-in program and its viability for a smaller provider like ourselves. I think that they've done definitely things that I think are attractive to smaller providers, like the DPS system means that you don't have to constantly reapply for local authority bids, so that should help. The lot sizes, I think, are more applicable for smaller providers like ourselves, so that should give us some kind of enthusiasm to apply for these programs. However, I think on the flip side, that there are things like open access requirements that aren't always suitable for smaller ISPs like ourselves that we have to consider. The level of kind of reporting, I think, is a big issue for us being smaller in terms of effort and resource that we have to align to these programs. And I think the clawback mechanism in the future is, again, something that we're kind of very aware of, and the fact that it provides a level of uncertainty for an organisation like ourselves for a long period of time. So those are the kind of negatives for us. I think we definitely see the attractiveness of a voucher scheme being more kind of viable for us in the future, and we're very keen to understand from Ryan and Matt, what that program looks like beyond March 21, because we see that as a more viable investment opportunity from the government than the outside-in program at the moment.
Yeah, from my side, I mean, very much largely, I think that's very well put there. I actually think it's, the program is from what we've seen so far is quite fairly put together. And if we're going to turn around to Catherine at Openreach and say, look, we should be given some of this funding, then actually we've got to step up to the plate and be professional enough that we're prepared to go and bid for these things and take on some of the contractual obligations. I think that I agree on the wholesale point, although I think the wholesale point is a problem for the INCA community as a whole, and we've got to solve that problem. I think wholesale will be solved in the next couple of years, and I think there are actually in the long term are some exciting opportunities out of wholesale. I actually think the biggest problem we're going to find out of wholesale is getting the retail service providers on board. And I kind of feel for them, do they want to go and integrate with 50 smaller providers? I understand that, but at the end of the day, if those providers in those areas are providing a fantastic service, it actually disincentivizes the retail service providers to come on board, because you've got someone who's giving a great service, picks up the phone straight away, is local, knows the local area. Why are you going to be able to pick up a large chunk of that market? And you've got to integrate with someone smaller. So the challenge is more a structural one from the retail service provider. I don't think technically it's very difficult for us to offer wholesale. Whether we will have it taken up in a way that BDUK expects is going to be a challenge. But no, we're certainly excited about it, and I think as that comes, I think that will give some certainty as we're all growing up as businesses. That gives certainty around where we're going to be delivering and where we're going to be investing. And I think one of the biggest questions I'd have on it, probably for Catherine, is how are we going to integrate with Openreach and with BT around some of BT's USO obligations, and how are we going to integrate where the market needs to come together and integrate much better. And actually, I think where Catherine says that you can deliver up to and beyond the 80% mark in rural areas viably as a viable investment, I don't think that makes sense if there are two operators in those areas, because where you're delivering 500 meters or a kilometer of infrastructure in some cases for a customer, if that's delivering 500 kilometers for half of a customer or half of the take up you're expecting, that does suddenly change the viability. And so my biggest question is, how do we all start talking, particularly with Openreach, so that we can do this sensibly and meet the deadline?
Yeah, I think for Catherine, if I could ask you the $1 million question, I think it was always, will we ever see a day when Openreach shares networks with some of the altnets to provide services?
I'd argue it's a $5 billion question, but
if I park that just for a second and come back to the sort of the point about the sort of broader build, which partly answers it. I mean, there have been a few questions again on the Q&A sort of around broader transparency. Transparency is a difficult one, I think, in terms of some of the questions around concern around overbuilds in certain areas. It's very difficult for us as the incumbent, because we have competition law and all sorts of other constraints. What we therefore have done, and have done voluntarily, is we have published visibility on where we are building at sort of location level and then exchange level, which again is a voluntary thing that we then do to try and give people a perspective on where we're going. So we have 2 years visibility and build for the sort of broad full fibre programme, but actually we've given 3 years visibility on the 3.2 million commercial rural. So to your point, Hector, on the sort of overlap and sort of the investment cases in sort of the trickier area 3, we've given 3 years visibility on that, and we'll update on an exchange by exchange basis when we actually go into build, because obviously, as you know, as all of you know who try to do rural, until you actually show up somewhere, you never quite know how tricky it's going to be and whether you can actually deliver it. So we are trying to give, from Openreach, a degree of transparency which then informs the industry. I think we've had discussions with DCMS and others sort of more broadly around this issue, and I think it's something that needs to be driven by DCMS, because it's something I think it's very difficult for us as the operators to do, which is why we do that transparency. On the network side, I think it's very interesting. You know, certainly when you go deeper and deeper into the network, while Openreach has an ambition to be the nationwide network, we only have an 86% super fast footprint. You know, I can kind of imagine we'd look to have a sort of similar FTTP footprint at some stage, which therefore means there'll be places we are not. And, you know, there's certainly maybe points in the future, I think, where if we're going to work with CPs and ISPs who want a sort of more holistic network in certain areas, you could potentially see situations where we are trying to think about those kind of considerations going forward to join up bits of the network. I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't think any of us are quite at a scale yet that that's necessarily attractive for the CPs, but I do think it's an interesting one, especially obviously when you get to a point where you're turning off networks, and there is only therefore sort of one available to people, and how you potentially join that up in the future.
Thank you very much. That's a good answer. So, Michael, you were interjecting earlier. I'm not sure if you've missed your moment, but you're
Michael,
still
you're
on mute,
muted.
Michael. There you go. Just on mute, Michael.
Yeah, sorry, I'm happy to re-engage. And actually, just looking at some of the questions coming up on the chat session or on the Q&A session. I mean, there was an earlier discussion around, you know, it seemed to be sort of fibre and fixed wireless as sort of separate distinctions, and somehow you migrate from fixed wireless into fibre, and that's, you know, that's Voneus's plan, and it's definitely been our plan. But you know, I think should be embracing, you know, it's a both and. It's not a one then, you know, first and thereafter. And what I mean by that is you know, we're building networks in rural Wales, and some really rural Wales. And we're getting average prices, not the extreme single farm hours, but some average costs coming in at £4,000 or £5,000 per home connected, and that's, you know, that's a stretch. That's making full use of voucher schemes, really, you know, to the limit. And is that absolutely the best use of public funds? I'm not terribly sure. And you know, and you've got fixed wireless and you've got 5G just begging to be used alongside. So I think, you know, the real advantage in rural areas is the lower cost of provision that comes from a joined up view of fibre and wireless, whether that's conventional fixed wireless access or whether it's a variant on 5G. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to shift thinking around what's the legitimate cost base in rural areas, and therefore to expand the market, expand the addressable commercial market. You know, and investors seem to share that view. I'm not sure if that what question that answers, but it's an answer.
No, very good. Well, Malcolm has arrived, so that means we're out of time.
No, Malcolm, thank you
very much for taking place in the panel. I think it was very interesting, and I'll hand back over to Malcolm to carry on with the conference.
Thanks very much, Matt. That's really good. And thanks to all the panelists again. Very, very useful session. Great questions coming out of the participants in the conference. And Catherine, well, very interesting comments that you were making towards the end then. Thank you very much indeed. We're now going into a short networking break. We're almost back on time, actually. So we'll expect to see everybody back at 11:15. Chat to people on your tables, and it's a real pity we don't have all those really nice little croissants and cakes and things like that with coffee coming around being served to us, but we can all rush to our kitchens and make some, I'm sure. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, everyone, and we'll be back in a few minutes' time. 11:15.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.